We are live for another episode of Deep Dive, and I am thrilled to add another chapter to this series all about Joshi wrestling and its illustrious history. We have already talked about the 70s. Now let's go into the 80s, which was a peak time for All Japan Women's Wrestling. So I hope you are excited to dive into this again. I know I am. Stay tuned.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Women's Wrestling Talk, the #1 women's wrestling show on the planet.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Deep Dive. I have been thrilled to really go and look back at the amazing history of Joshi wrestling as a whole. And as we know, when you're starting off with that type of history, you really have to break it down because literally into decades, because of how much history surrounds Joshi wrestling and all of the accomplishments and the events and the legends that have come from this this one country, and how much women have been able to do in Japan. To me, it seems like light years before those things happened. And America is absolutely astounding. So it really needs like its own separate episodes, as you can see, in its own series to cover all of it. So we started off with the last episode of Deep Dive, really getting into those founding years of All Japan Women's Wrestling, as they were really the first to solidify women's wrestling in Japan. There had been attempts before, but with the advent of Nojibert coming to Japan in the 50s and really kind of having like a blueprint to show what women's wrestling could be, and many times not being able to be fully accomplished even in the US, Japan saw this blueprint and really ran with it and created something absolutely phenomenal. And last week we talked about those stepping stones into creating what the 80s had in store for us with women's wrestling. And there is a lot to cover about what was happening in the 80s. Dare say for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling, the 80s was a peak moment in time, or should I say decade, for the company because of all the things that wind up happening at that time. And I think, and there's obviously like a lot of debate surrounding this, so it's totally fine. The reason why I would say that it was a peak for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling, who was at that time the only promotion for women's wrestling in Japan that had that level of popularity. That peak was due to the amazing storylines and feuds that you started to see really developing and characters really being built in a much different way than what we saw in the 70s, where All Japan Pro Wrestling was really just trying to get its footing. In the 80s, you really started to see a lot of women start to find their characters and really run with some great storylines. And you really started to see these legends start to be built in such a short period of time. It was absolutely amazing to see and witness that as a fan and see how much these female wrestlers could accomplish in a very short career that they had to have because of the fact that they had to retire at 26. So let's get right into it. During the 1980s, All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling continued to feature extraordinarily talented wrestlers such as Bon Nakano, Devil Masami, Dump Matsumoto, and of course the insanely popular Crush Gals. One of the most popular angles in All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling at the time was between the tag teams of the Crush Gals and the heel staple Atrocious Alliance, led by Matsumoto. Quite possibly one of the best angles in all of Japanese wrestling in the 80s. It brought on very high ratings, reaching upwards to 10 million views weekly for All Japan's Women's Pro Wrestling show on Fuji TV, which caused the show to be aired during prime time. I can't really even say to this day that that is something that can fully be accomplished with the all women's wrestling show. So that is absolutely phenomenal. Actually, really 10 million views weekly in this current era is still hard to achieve, whether you have an all women's pro wrestling show or not. So that is a really big deal, and it really puts up to perspective how popular All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling is, and how these phenomenal feuds help to get those numbers to where they were. The promotion of All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling had enough popularity to run more shows throughout the country, which resulted in All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling splitting up into two teams. Team A featured wrestlers like Jackie Sato, Jaguar Yokota, and Mimi Hagiwara, while Team B featured Nancy Kumi, Lucy Kayama, and Chino Sato. Now, this was something that they were, kind of testing, but it didn't last long, as they only had this idea of different teams until June of 1981. But you can see with this decade coming into slowly into the perspective that they wanted to try new ideas and see what would stick, what wouldn't. So you know what, we get an A for effort with trying to come up with the different teams. At the start of this decade, we really start to see a stark difference between the audience members from the 70s to the 80s. In the 70s, you really saw this great sense of respect and reverence. As I said last week, to me, kind of similar to what you would usually see an audience behave like during the Olympics, and not obviously foreign to Japanese wrestling fans to usually sit, clap during certain things and keep that level of decorum. But in the 80s, and I think this definitely started off with groups like the Beauty Pair in the 70s, you really started to see in the 80s these women, these young girls, I should say teenagers, becoming completely unglued when their favorite wrestlers would come out. You would see a sea of color-coordinated teenage fans that would be at ringside, and they would pour all of their hopes and dreams into their babyface wrestlers in hopes that they would see a victory that night. And this idol fandom also resulted in a record number of girls wanting to become wrestlers, with the 1984 auditions for the All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling camp having approximately 2,000 candidates. So very quickly into this decade, you really see how much of a hold All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling has on their fan base, but the country of Japan, honestly, with so many women wanting, or young girls wanting to be a part of this promotion. During this decade, we also start to see a lot of standout events that continue to help the promotion create their own land and take advantage of the international popularity. And one that really became a staple for the company was certainly the Grand Prix that they continued on after their inaugural event, which took place in 1985. And this became an annual tournament that would determine who would be the #1 contender for the WWWA World Singles Championship. And the tournament was held every summer from 1985 to around 2004, with Lioness Ahsoka winning the first Grand Prix and Kumameko the last. And I love how in this grand history of the Grand Prix, you've had some winners that went on to really show their dominance in this Grand Prix and have several wins in their resume. One of them being Manami Toyota, winning the most Grand Prix, a whopping 4 times. So you could see with the contenders that would go on to have these great careers that the Grand Prix was a really great showcase and opportunity for someone to get in line to show that they were going to really become the ace of all Japan, all women's Japan Pro Wrestling at the time. And it's certainly something, as you always hear people go back to what some of their favorite matches from All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling, it usually involves some match that came from the Grand Prix tournament. So I love that with all of the different things that All Japan Pro Wrestling, All Women's Pro Wrestling wanted to do to really help them stand out, they brought on a really competitive, intense, and entertaining tournament like the Grand Prix. So we have that being set up right smack dab in the middle of the 80s, and the middle of the 80s for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling was a very pivotal time where there was just great ideas that were sticking and landing with the fans. Then once we start getting into the late 80s with certain events, we have the Bangkok International Indoor Stadium event. And I really loved going back, because this was actually the first time that I actually saw this tournament. I loved that we were seeing with All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling these special events that were taking place in other countries to really show globally what All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling was doing and how they had a really long reach with teenage female fans all over the world. And All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling went to this event hoping to fill the arena, which seated 5,000, but they had 10,000 fans in attendance, many of them having to only have room to stand, and thousands others having to wait outside to just hear the results of this event. So obviously a great success with this Bangkok International event. And before the event, all of the faces from the All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling roster went to visit war veterans at the hospital and thank them for their years of service. They answered any questions that reporters had. They also had a time where they went to a famous shopping mall in Thailand by bus, and they had thousands of fans that were trying to stop the bus so they could get to their favorite wrestler. It was just sheer pandemonium. And they also they attempted to eat at some of the local restaurants in Thailand and go shopping. And these fans were following them everywhere they went for this event. So during this Bangkok visit and this first big event for them in Thailand, they definitely felt the love from these fans that wanted to just get close to them as much as possible. And even when I was reading the description of how these fans were, it's just like that really cool 80s teen pop type of pop star type of vibes that you're getting from these fans, where they just feel like they have to be close to the baby faces on the roster for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling. And it was just really cool to see that at a time, looking at in the States, this was not happening at all. And for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling to have this great pull with female wrestling fans, not just in Japan, but all over the world, was pretty cool. So we actually get to the event. And this show features a live performance from the Crush Gals, which was really nice to open it up, which is not unusual for their shows. They usually have a performance. And you even see that still held up to this day by companies like Stardom that still like having that live performance aspect of the show. And it just brings a certain oomph to these shows. And the Crush Gals were also interviewed. They had an exclusive interview on the beach in Thailand before their matches. And I really like how they had these other segments to kind of make you feel like you're getting an inside peek into how the Crush Gals were, with the personalities, and really letting you feel like this is this exclusive event that's giving you the feeling that you can get close to the Crush Gals and kind of get a sense of who they were. And I think that this particular event really helped to show the great tag teams that they had. We had matches between the Crush Gals versus Suzuka Manami and Akira Hukotu, who was very young in her career at this time, really just starting out, and honestly looked nothing like how she looked in the 90s or even her personality. So it was really cool seeing Akira be a part of a tag team match with the Crush Gals, who were obviously very big stars at that time, and kind of seeing that early phase of her career. We also had Yumiko Hata, along with her partner Mizuku Nishiwaka versus Bull Nakano and Kumiko Awamoto. I absolutely love this match. I will get into it soon as I do the spotlights, but at this time, Bull Nakano, and to be honest, usually anyone that she was tagging with and any heel that usually had in the company really just played on the fact that they would do the dirtiest, slimy, grimiest things to come off as the worst people in the world and really not follow any of the rules that applied to the babyface team. And you definitely saw that in this match. So I definitely enjoyed it. I loved all of the heel tactics that were involved in these matches. And I just think it was a solid pay-per-view that really showed the best and upcoming talent that they had in the company around 1988. And once again, just a great way to branch off and show how broad their fan base was outside of Japan. So as we have these star events that were happening in New Japan, we see the ratings going to a level that was just astronomical. We really start to see some more ideas about helping to build up younger talent that's coming up. And we see that with Wrestle Marinepad in 1989, which I thought was a great event. It was a special event, a showcase in many ways for the rookies in the company to get a chance to prove that they would be the next stars in the next coming years. And the first event took place in 1989 and went on until 2002. And in this first Wrestle Marinepad event, we see the women of Glow actually attached to this as well. And it was very interesting, to say the least, to see the women of Glow actually be a part of this. They had some, because the reason why is because naturally, and we've seen at this point, whether it was in the 70s, early 80s, obviously mid 80s, we've seen this crossover between a lot of foreign talent, usually from WWE, have some interaction with the women, the Joshi wrestlers, and have some really great matches. But Glow usually was put into a different category where they were more so, I was like a play on what people who don't watch wrestling think about wrestlers, and very campy. So it was kind of funny to see Glow, some wrestlers from Glow, actually be a part of this event. And I think it's a general consensus that the matches that they had during this event weren't the best, but the women of Glow did do a good job of putting on some entertaining promos and coming off well as heels. We also see some early sightings of one of the first appearances of Medusa as she goes against Lioness Ahsoka in a solid match, but it seemed like the goal of this match was mostly to show that Medusa was going to be, and this was typical when foreigners would come in, of them usually being heels, them usually looking down on a Joshi wrestler and really trying to show their dominance against that babyface who usually prevails. So that was really Medusa's role in this match for this event. Now, even with the women of Glow participating in this show and even Medusa being a part of it, the main focus of this first Wrestle Marinepad event was actually to showcase Chigusa Nagayo's last match. This was supposed to be her retirement match. Now, it was supposed to be a retirement match, but there are many times throughout the show where you actually see Nagayo a part of some matches. She has a ceremony afterward that was really cool for them to give her that send off. So the focus was really on making sure that she had a proper goodbye. And as you see this particular annual event go on for the next few years, it starts to become a very impressive showcase. And we will definitely be bringing that up again once we get into the 90s decade on the next episode of Deep Dive. But this, to me, it wasn't, obviously, for this first event, it wasn't the most impressive Wrestle Marine event that they had, but it was a start, and there was some strengths to this event. But sometimes when you're starting out, you got to, take out the kinks and also let the younger talent have those times where they're learning how to showcase themselves better. So for that reason, I think that is something that you should check out if you want to. But of course, as you dive more into this event, once you start getting into the 90s, obviously the matches are phenomenal. So as we have just talked about the different events, highlighted some of the bigger events that happened in All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling in the 80s, we have to do a spotlight on some of the bigger stars in this promotion in the 80s. Now, if I wanted to list everyone that made an impact in all women's Japan Pro Wrestling at this time, we would be here all day. So I decided to make sure that usually when people talk about this company in the 80s, that I'm trying to highlight the ones that usually pop up the most. So please don't hit me if I don't bring up, what wrestler that you were thinking about. And the first woman that I wanted to highlight, as she was brought up last week, but she came into the company really in the last year of the 70s and really started to get her footing afterwards, was Monster Ripper. She really had a nice run once we really started getting into maybe like the last few months of the 70s, 79, going into the 80s. And growing up in Calgary, Ripper attended numerous Stampede wrestling events. She even approached the Hart family about being trained, but she was rejected due to them not training women at the time. She saw women's wrestling during a trip to Hawaii, and she was even more convinced that this was something she wanted to pursue. So she contacted no one other than Mildred Burke and started training with her shortly after. And she was scouted by All Japan Women's Wrestling after that. She made her debut in the company in a match with Mami Kumamoto, defeating the Beauty Pair in 1979. I just absolutely love that Monster Ripper really took it upon herself to really get into the business and actually go to the source for who actually even helped to make All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling reality, with laying out that blueprint for what women can do in women's wrestling. Mildred Burke getting that knowledge that really made her such a phenomenal wrestler and really made an impact in the company within her first few months of coming into All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling. I really took time to look at her accomplishments in the 80s because, as we know, we have seen Monster Ripper in the US when she was in WWE in the 90s as Bertha Faye, but I really wanted to tap into this stark difference in how she was presented in All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling. And just looking at her accomplishments in the 80s, she held the WWWA World Singles Championship twice. And even though the women of All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling really did not like working with foreign wrestlers, she still tried to push for that, but it was really hard for Monster Ripper to feel comfortable in the company. So she created a lot of great moments, had some seriously amazing matches, and great feuds in the company, but it wasn't something that lasted throughout the decade. She just simply couldn't really adapt fully to being in the company. And she decided to leave All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling for a bit, and she started competing in the revamped Stampede Wrestling, and then went on to WWE, where once again she was in a situation where she wasn't the most comfortable with how she was being used and how she was being presented with the Bertha Faye character. She actually asked for her release in WWE, and from that point on, she spent some time in Mexico, specifically the AAA wrestling promotion, and in Canada. And she returned to All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling for a stint, but she really didn't like the new system of the company and left again. So even though Monster Ripper didn't have a super long career in the company, she still brought up for the type of feuds that she had in matches that she did have in the company, that I think really set home what a powerhouse she was as a heel and as a wrestler. So even though it wasn't long, I had to throw her name in the hat, because she really did make a lasting impression. And definitely someone like me who grew up in the 90s, having no idea that she had this completely different character outside of WWE, was really fascinating to discover over the past few years. So that was definitely something that I wanted to make sure that I highlighted. But now we're going to move on to another big star that was a great part of that fabric of 80s wrestling in All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling, and that is Jaguar Yokota. I really loved taking a look at her catalog and her body of work. She is considered one of the greatest wrestlers to come from All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling, and she was inspired to join All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling because of her love of the Beauty Pair tag team from the 70s. And she began training in 1977, and she made her debut at just 15 years old. She soon created a tag team named Young Pair with Siko Hanawa, and on January 4th, 1980, Jaguar won the All Japan Women's Junior Championship, but vacated the title in August of that year, and soon went on to become the inaugural All Japan Women's Wrestling's champion. Then she won the WWE Women's Tag Team Championship 2 days later. She soon went on to defeat her hero, Jackie Sato, which was part of the Beauty Pair, for the WWWA Women's Championship a year later. So she did all these things by the age of 19, certainly making an impact very early in her start, and clearly the company saw something in her, and they definitely should have. She had memorable feuds with Devil Masami and Lioness Ahsoka. That's usually the two feuds that are brought up the most. And in 1986, she retired from in-ring action for a few years and then returned to wrestling until I think a few years ago, I believe. So a very long, impactful time that Jaguar had in this business. And certainly, like I said, such an impressive resume, a very illustrious career that has many evolutions, ebbs and flows. So if you have never checked out her work, I definitely recommend that you do that. So talking about Jaguar's hero and someone that certainly got her into business, I have to talk about Jackie Sato again. Now, she was a big part of last week's episode, as she was one of the most successful women's wrestlers in the 70s in All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling, but she was able to still have a career after the 70s, and a career she had as a solo wrestler. Jackie did not stop at all. Following her uber success in the tag team Beauty Pair, Jackie also found success in a solo career, winning the WWWA Single World Championship in 1977. She held it twice and defeated Monster Ripper and Nancy Kumi. Jackie was also responsible for training future stars in the company, such as Devil Masami, the Jumping Bomb Angels, and Jaguar Yokota. So you can see that not only did Jackie have her own singular goals with being in the company, and she certainly did that, but she clearly had a desire to really build up that next generation of wrestlers that could really continue to keep with the success and also the style that All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling was trying to have for their company. And I love that selflessness to make sure that you're leaving the company better than when you started. And you could see that it was a no-brainer for Jackie Sato to start JWP in 1986, which would become a rival company for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling, which we will get into, because she had that desire to care about the next crop of women coming into the company and what they could bring to the table. And possibly, even in a little selfish way, making sure that there's great competition for her moving forward by making sure that these women are being trained correctly. She knew, obviously, that her time would be done in All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling. So why not create a lane for other female wrestlers and still stay in the wrestling business at the same time? So Jackie Sato really not only contributed a lot with her enormous success in a tag team in the 70s, then her successful career continued on solo in the 80s, but also the women that she trained also became legends in the business. So Jackie Sato is a very important woman to think about when you think about the history of All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling. So we move on to Mimi Hagiwara, and she was also trained by Jackie Sato in 1977. And Mimi came from the acting and singing world, but she was curious about getting into women's pro wrestling. And she actually had success in the short amount of time that she was in the business. She made her debut against Jaguar Yokota, and Mimi rose to prominence by becoming known as the Giant Killer, as she was a very statuesque, smaller woman. I love that they kind of pinned her to more of the bigger women in the business to kind of have that David and Goliath type of feel to her matches. She took down women like Judy Martin, Max to You, and Monster Ripper. She had her first title reign after she defeated Ikushida in 1981 for the All Pacific Championship, then vacated the singles title after 6 months to tag with Yakara Omori to successfully become champs a month later. They really had chemistry as a tag team, so I really enjoyed looking at those matches. The pair had a really impressive 274-day reign before losing the tag titles and splitting up. Mimi would go on to have some solo success after defeating Judy Martin for the All Pacific title in a 3 falls match, and she held it for more than a year before she had to retire. And she had to retire due to internal injuries that she actually did know about really early into her career. It seemed like she was kind of putting it off a bit. But, you know, those injuries, they're going to continue to be an issue. So she had to give up that spot and take care of her health. So she did not have a long career, and she retired in the 80s. But she did leave a legacy of being a babyface that really knew how to sell and to get the fans wrapped up in their emotions of wanting her to win. And I really implore you to really check out Mimi's matches, because you really get locked in as a fan, seeing how well she took to the psychology of wrestling and really making you feel like you wanted her to win. So even though she did not have a long career, I think she really played a really good role in showing how a lot of women in the company at that time were really getting amazing with having that in-ring psychology and really bringing it in that way in the company. So now we move on to one that has been making the rounds in the news lately because of her impending WWE Hall of Fame induction, and that is Bull Nakano. Now, everybody, understand, I am just covering the 80s career of Bull Nakano. There is so much more that will be talked about with Bull Nakano in the 90s, but I'm just keeping it, okay, in the 80s. And in the 80s, Nakano started her career when she was 15. She won the Juniors Championship in 1984 at the age of 16. And in July 1985, she won the AJW World Championship and held it for 3 years. She came under the tutelage of Matsumoto, who she also tagged with. As a pair of heels, they won the WWWA tag titles in 1986. And Bull and Matsumoto had the opportunity to wrestle in WWF against Velvet McIntyre and Dawn Marie Johnston. Nakano won the WWWA Tag Team Championships again in 1987 and 1988, but with a different partner, and won the All Japan Grand Prix in 1988. In 1989, she won the All Pacific title from Mizutsuru Nishiwaki. During this time, Bull Nakano was a solid mid-carder that was really starting to make a name for herself. And at that time, just like we've seen with a lot of wrestlers starting out, she really was under that tutelage of Dump Matsumoto and really wasn't in a place to say anything. She had to go with the flow of anything that was happening in the staple of Atrocious Alliance, which we will be getting into. And it was a different Bull Nakano than what we're used to, maybe going in towards that mid to late 80s and definitely into the 90s, where she really was her own woman. This was a different Bull Nakano. Even with the picture that I'm showing here, this doesn't really represent the look that she really had in the 80s. You really see Bull trying to find where she is, and it's really cool to see how she really developed naturally and organically with really being under the tutelage of Dump Matsumoto. And I really love seeing this evolution with her being part of such a heel staple and then really finding herself and then really getting these accolades that clearly she deserved to get. So just like I said, we're going to dive more into Bull's solo career as we step into the 90s, because she went from the 80s being a part of a staple where she really did not have a say in her career to moving more into that mid-carder phase, a solid mid-carder that really was starting to get that attraction. And then once she started getting into maybe 89 and then definitely into the 90s, she becomes considered an ace in the company. Let's move on to Bull Nakano's mentor at the time and one of the best heels I've ever seen in the company. That was Dump Matsumoto. And during the mid to late 80s, Dump was seen as one of the leading ladies in All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling. She was the leader of the Atrocious Alliance staple, one of the best heel staples in wrestling history, in my humble opinion. Dump was a long-running antagonist to the Crush Gals and truly embraced this role. Until then, I don't believe in women's wrestling there was ever a crueler, brutal, volatile monster like Matsumoto on a roster. Honestly, I would be very shocked if we can find someone that had that cruelness like she did, but she definitely embraced it. And she made her debut in 1980. And for a bit of time in her training, from what I've seen and read, she really wasn't landing where All Japan Women's Wrestling thought she should. And there were times where she was possibly going to be told to, pack up, and that maybe wrestling wasn't for her. But it was one day when she decided to come up with this character, and it really worked for her. And by 1983, she won her first title, the WWE World title, after she defeated Lioness Ahsoka, which led her to holding that title for 3 years. She captured the WWE tag titles with Crane Yu on February 25th, 1985, when they defeated the Crush Gals. However, the title had to be vacated after Crane retired 2 months later, due to her age, of course. Her infamous feud with Chigusa Nagayo saw brutal matches, including one of the best matches that I have ever seen in my life, which was the hair versus hair match 1 against with Dump Matsumoto and Chigusa Nagayo. This is a match that I will always recommend this until the end of time. One of the best matches and feuds I have ever seen in my life, and it was a pleasure to go back and view this feud again. She saw singles gold again in 1985 when she beat Devil Masumi in 1986 for the WWE World Championship. And with such a illustrious career, Dump Matsumoto fought her last match in February of 1988. Of course, whenever I'm giving these retirement matches, please keep in mind that some women decided to come back sometimes 5 or 10 years later after they had to. They were forcibly told to retire from All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling. So keep that in mind. But I think in Dump's case, she actually was retired maybe like 10 or 15 years, and then she made like a few appearances. She really did retire. As much as she was involved in her character and fully embracing it, it did take a toll mentally, being probably one of the most hated people in the country because of how well she portrayed that character. So yeah, I definitely think if you have never seen Dump Matsumoto's work, check it out. You will not be sorry. Moving on to someone who did start out in the 80s, but just like Nakano was trying to like find her character and really started to get into that groove toward the late 80s, was someone that we know very well, and I hope soon would also be a pick for the WWE Hall of Fame soon, and that is Aja Kong. Aja Kong started out in 1986, where she trained and made her debut against Nariro Toyota. And Kong immediately joined the heel stable, Atrocious Alliance. And in 1988, the stable dissolved, and Aja formed a tag team with Nobuko Kimura and called it Junko Jack in 1990. In the 90s, that's where you really see the Aja Kong that we know, and we see her have that very successful solo career that's still going on to this day. So I would say if you're thinking about Aja Kong in the mid to late 80s, really think about it as more of like a coming out party to her really just trying to find who she is, what type of character she is, and what she wants the crowd to think about her in the company, and seeing that really evolve and become something in the 90s. So we move on to our next spotlight. And I definitely think when I was coming up with thinking about this series and thinking about women's wrestlers in the 80s, I definitely had to think about Devil Masami. She was one of the first that popped into my head, and she made her All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling debut in August 21st, 1978. She began teaming with Tarantula in 1981, winning the NWA World Tag Team Championship in August of 82. In April of 1984, she defeated Judy Martin to win the All-Pacific Championship. On December, she won the WWA Singles Championship in a match against Dub Matsumoto. And in December 26, 1987, Masami faced off against Chikusa Nagayo in her mandatory retirement match. She did retire from All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling, but she went on to wrestle for JWP after this and Gaia Japan in the mid-90s. And one thing that I loved with going back and researching Masami is that she just had like a really hard-nosed, rough style that really worked, especially with her height and her ability in the ring. I like that she had more of that style. And I love the time she was a babyface and she would face off against wrestlers like Monster Ripper. I felt like her tall stature and heavy-handed style really did make her stand out in the 80s. And whether she was a heel, which I did enjoy that time too, because it really seemed like she fully embraced that in a different way than, let's say, Bull Nakano or Matsumoto, still a heel. But I did enjoy the times when she was a babyface as well. I think she was one of the very few that could really switch in and out of those roles. And she's definitely left a huge impact on the wrestling business. And I think it will be remiss for me to not bring up and kind of elaborate a little bit more on, just like I said, one of the best heel staples in the company at that time, and honestly, I would say just in Joshi wrestling history, the Atrocious Alliance, which was comprised of Dump Matsumoto, Bull Nakano, Crane, and Condor Sato, and just like I mentioned at one point, Aja Kong. This, to me, was one of the most vicious staples that I have ever seen in wrestling to this day. The sheer joy that this staple would take in annihilating the Crush Girls was just insanely homicidal. And I'm ashamed to say it, but I loved every moment of it. One of the best matches from this feud was definitely the hair versus hair match between Nagayo and Dump Matsumoto. You get everything in it. It was just so cinematic. And I think that many times people just bring up the hair versus hair match, the first one, but the second one to me helped to fully tell that story completely. I love how you got everything in this match. You have both of their teams at ringside, and you see Nagayo shows how much of a babyface she is by how much of a sacrifice she makes throughout this feud, with usually being at the mercy of Dump Matsumoto's attacks. And you really see in this first hair versus hair match, Nagayo taking so much from Dump, getting stabbed in her forehead with, I believe it was either a fork or a knife, something. And Nagayo bleeding profusely after being stabbed several times. And also the ref really tried it because he was so careful to make sure that Nagayo wasn't attacking or illegally doing things. But apparently someone literally getting stabbed in the head in the middle of the ring is something that he just never noticed. But you know what? We have those disgusting referees, that don't see certain things. But Nagayo taking that, getting hit with chairs, getting attacked by the rest of Atrocious Alliance, the many matches that the Crush Gals had to have with the Atrocious Alliance and having to receive these horrible beatings. Many times the commentators also getting beat up just for sitting there. It was awesome seeing such a heelish team not caring. And also what made it even better was the fact that Atrocious Alliance knew how much the fans loved them, so they loved making the fans cry and getting that emotion from them because their favorite tag team was just being destroyed by them. It was just perfection. I love just the level of investment that the Atrocious Alliance had and making sure that they were hated by every single person in the arena. It was just brilliant. And even with the look that you see from the stable, they truly were the embodiment of like the 70s and 80s punk rock scene. A scene that I always loved growing up. So it was really cool to see that there was this genuine depiction of someone that would live like on the fringes of society would actually be like in wrestling instead of seeing like a caricature of it. So that was really cool to discover about the Atrocious Alliance. And I remember reading that this staple received so much hate from the fans that on many occasions their bus was surrounded by fans who wanted to harm them. And then even at one point, Matsumoto being punched in the face by a fan when she was coming to the ring. So this was legit heat that I don't even know like if right now, because I know everybody's been talking about like the type of heat that The Rock has received with this feud with Cody Rhodes, but this type of heat, and we've heard it before, especially like in the 70s and 80s when you would have fans actually attacking you. I don't know, like if you can receive that anymore, because at this time kayfabe was alive and well. So I can't speak more about how much I love the Atrocious Alliance and how real it would get in these matches that they would have with the Crush Gals. So talking about the heel side of it, we have to talk about one of the most successful points of All Japan was pro wrestling certainly was because of the Crush Gals and the way they just resonated with the teen fans. On January 4th, 1983, Yakuza Nakano and Lioness Hisoka came together to form the historic tag team Crush Gals. Immediately, these two women had chemistry and really complemented one another as a team. The team gained popularity after a losing effort on August 27th in the title match for the WWE tag titles against the Dynamite Girls. In August of that year, the Crush Gals released their first music single called Bible of Fire, selling 1,000 copies. On August 25th, the Crush Gals finally defeated their rivals, the Dynamite Girls, to capture the titles. 2 years later, the Crush Gals started an epic rivalry against the Atrocious Alliance and drew a rating of 12.0 million people every week on Fuji TV. Yeah, that's how much they were invested in this feud. And the popularity of the Crush Gals was so insane that Nagayo has claimed that she had to move frequently due to fans waiting in front of her home. So you had that blend, that amazing 80s blend of wrestling success and that pop culture music success that the Crush Gals were able to capitalize on. And I just loved how they had, to me, one of the cool part of the 80s is having just that bubblegum pop sound that young teens loved and really banking on that, and also playing on the androgynous look that was so popular in the 80s, and it really worked for them. All Japan was pro wrestling knew when to pull out something that would really work, and when someone gelled as a team and really just pushed for them to also have a music career, and that definitely worked for the Crush Gals. They knew when to tap into that. In the middle of the 80s, that was the perfect time. Everyone, no matter what country you were from, loved them some pop music, and they definitely had some success with that formula. And Nagayo and Matsumoto, as I mentioned, had their own feud within this tag team war. And the Crush Gals were usually taken to the ringer by the Atrocious Alliance, but they were able to get their revenge when they defeated the Atrocious Alliance to win the 1985 Tag League The Best event. In 1986, Nagayo suffered a knee injury, causing the Crush Gals to vacate the title, but recaptured it in March of 86 against the Jumping Bomb Angels. But even with that successful return, the Crush Gals broke up, and of course, their rabid teenage fan base absolutely hated this breakup, but they did go on to have successful solo careers after that. So we go from one amazingly successful tag team, which I don't think anyone after this was able to reach that height of success, but still moving on to a tag team that still has some great success, in my opinion, and is actually one of my favorites. That happens to be the Jumping Bomb Angels. They really, to me, help to also embody that thing that I really loved about the 80s. We have Noriyu Tatino and Izuku Yamasaki formed the tag team of the Jumping Bomb Angels in the mid-80s. So I love that All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling made sure that not only did you have the Crush Gals with their success, but they made sure that they had equally brilliant tag teams to be a part of that, so that the Crush Gals can have a great tag team to also compete with and to really create a red hot tag team division during the mid-80s. And on January 5th, 1986, the Jumping Bomb Angels defeated both Nakano and Kondo Sato to win the vacant WWA World Tag Team Championships. And in 1987, the Jumping Bomb Angels entered the WWF, making their debut at the Survivor Series of that year and winning for their team. At the 1988 Royal Rumble, the Jumping Bomb Angels defeated the Glamour Girls in a 2 out of 3 falls match to win the WWF World Tag Team Championship. I think that with and the goal possibly of bringing on the Jumping Bomb Angels into a different atmosphere, they were able to really bring in a new, more exciting, high-flying team to one of the biggest promotions in the US. And you can see that type of faith that WWE kind of had with showcasing your Jumping Bomb Angels more than once, and even letting them get the opportunity to have the WWF Women's Tag Team Championships. So not only did the Jumping Bomb Angels have that success in Japan, but they were able to be one of the few that sometimes we come back to talk about that actually got a really good response from a US fan base that wasn't really used to seeing really successful high-flying tag teams that happened to be women at the time. So I really love that the Jumping Bomb Angels were able to get this type of success, but it also brings up another conversation, which is about WWF now, with seeing the success of everything that All Japan Women's Wrestling was doing, that they started utilizing that All Japan Women's Wrestling talent. And during the 80s, on a global scale, we start to see the idea of women's wrestling being entertained more than it had since the first golden era in wrestling, which was in the 40s and 50s. WWE started on a certain level investing into women's wrestling when they introduced the women's title, which belonged to the Fabulous Moolah. And WWE really strapped the rocket on Wendy Richter in the mid-80s for her to be the it girl in the company with the rock and wrestling era. So of course, if you're going to have Wendy become it girl, you have to actually form a division. So you start seeing US talent like Rockin' Robin, the Glamour Girls, Sherry Martel, and others really being used. But WWE decided to turn it up a notch when they called on select talent from All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling to bring a more modern approach to wrestling in the States. Most of the women in WWE at that time, I'm trying to say it nicely, they were trained by Fabulous Moolah. So certain times you would see certain moves that were just replicated and repeated in the matches, and it didn't always show that shift that you were seeing in wrestling in the 80s to a more fast-paced style that fans around the world were interested in seeing. So I thought this was a great move that WWE made to show some younger talent that really had this very exciting dynamic style. So when the WWE programming showcased phenomenal teams like the Jumping Bomb Angels against the Glamour Girls, or the Crush Gals, who also made appearance in WWE, or Don't Matsumoto and Bon Nakano, it really lit up the crowds and allowed them to see Joshi wrestling. And that when you saw the stark difference between the US wrestlers and the Joshi wrestlers, it really made you see how ahead Joshi wrestling was to US based wrestling. And I like how, despite WWE going in and out of whether they want a division for women or not in the company, they still kept a good relationship with All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling, as we see when they tried to revive the women's division in the 90s. But I thought this was great advertisement for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling as we started to get more into the era of tape sharing and having a lot of wrestling critics, like for instance Dave Meltzer at the time, talk in a very positive way about All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling, that you really started to see this attention surrounding All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling. And certainly if you're going to be on a very popular programming like WWE, that's only going to help you look like $1 million, especially when All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling were just light years ahead of what women in the US were doing. Honestly, if we're going to be honest, they definitely were. So we go into maybe like the middle and the end of the decade. You start to realize there is a monopoly that All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling have. And they were very comfortable being the only Joshi promotion around, and fully use that monopoly to dictate the ending of someone's career before it can really take off, or end that career when it was at that wrestler's peak, which was just truly brutal to see. So some wrestlers decided to take matters into their own hands and create promotions that would cater to the over the 26-year mark for a lot of wrestlers. And they were also known to enforce the 3 no's in their company: no smoking, no drinking, and no boys. And from what a lot has been said about that time, that the All Japan Women's locker room was very toxic. Now, we've heard this about other companies too, but when you feel like there's a ticking time bomb on your career and you literally have to end it at such a young age, and also there's so many restrictions, there's bound to be a lot of animosity and problems backstage. So we start to see that some women want to make sure that they could possibly continue on with their career, or that they could help other women that really still had a lot that they could still accomplish in their career and didn't really get that opportunity. So we see the start of JWP, which was, as I mentioned before, established by Jackie Sato because she had to retire and end her career, more than likely not at a time when she really wanted to, but she also had the desire to want to develop some talent from people that she felt were up and coming and that could really benefit, but then also fellow female wrestlers that did make a name for themselves that still had a lot to accomplish. So the first JWP event took place on August 17, 1986. And JWP was imagined to be a wrestling version of a Japanese idol music group. And JWP did not have the 3 no's rule or an early retirement rule. So this promotion was obviously very attractive to a lot of wrestlers that still wanted to continue to go on, or some wrestlers that just wanted an alternative option to get into the business. So the promotion quickly recruited women like Shinobu Kandori, who won the 1984 World Judo Championship. And at their first show, Antonio Inoki attended. So already this promotion was starting off on a good note with a lot of hype around it. Already, even though they had the positives, the promotion did begin to show some fractures with Jackie Sato injured the eye of Kandori in a match on July 18th, 1987. And a match that turned into a shoot, and to this day is still pretty controversial. So that was already not a good sign. And then October of that year, Kandori appeared at an All Japan Women's Wrestling event and challenged Yagari Amori, which of course is completely insane, as she's in a company that's trying to grow and you literally go to the biggest women's wrestling promotion, or you go back to show that you actually want to be a part of that company. So I cannot imagine how everyone behind the scenes at JWP was feeling about Kandori making that appearance. And even though she challenged Amari, she was not able to compete with her due to her contractual disputes and her obligation to stay in the JWP promotion. So Jackie Sato also retired in March 20th, 1988, and that took off a major star and attraction for fans to get behind this new promotion. And the promotion officially closed in 1992, but they were revamped shortly after. And we will definitely get into that revamped stage in the 90s episode. But after the retirement of the Crush Gals, even for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling, their ratings started to decline a bit, so much so that their TV show was moved to midnight. So you started to see, once we get out of that peak, and a lot of women retired during this time. You had Nagayo that retired, Dump Matsumoto, Lioness Ahsoka, Crane, Yukari Amori, like a lot of women, Jaguar Yokota, a lot of big stars that helped draw in a lot of views for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling had to hang up their boots. So that took away a lot of views. And then if you think about it, a lot of things that you may have enjoyed as a teenager, you probably weren't interested in that once you started moving into your college years and beyond. So you had these very excited, very intense female teenage viewers that would come to the shows and obviously watch the show on Fuji TV. They were growing up within the decade of the 80s and they weren't watching as much. So that all played a part into those phenomenal ratings starting to go down. Now, as we know, there was some amazing things that happened in All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling in the 90s, but you start to see, once you get to the end of the 80s, that there was a shift, in that despite the amazing talent that was still coming into All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling, that there was going to be some competition from other companies coming up, but most importantly, it wasn't going to be the same as that peak time that All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling had in the mid-80s. So we're going to get to the conclusion of this episode, a little bit of my final thoughts about the 80s decade for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling. But first, I have to get to a commercial break.
Hey, yo, you. Yeah, you that's watching this. You sitting on the couch staring at the screen not knowing what you want to do, like this is an online college. Are you tired of wearing shirts that make you look like an extra stuck in catering? Do you want to step your wrestling swag game up to the next level? Then Women's Wrestling Talk has got you covered. Like literally. Are you for life in pink or black and white? Or maybe you're the EST and people need to respect you accordingly. Want to put some pride in your stride and show off the muscle in your hustle? Then make sure you check out the WWT store. Not now, but right now. Alright? What you waiting for? Head to www.talkpodstore.com and don't make me fight you. Shit.
All right, y'all, go get that merchandise, okay? Because the boss lady TK is not playing around. All right, so as we have dived into the many events, stars, controversies surrounding All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling in the 80s, we have to come up with this final thought and wrap up this splendid decade and one of the biggest decades that All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling had. And I guess to pretty much sum it up, I would say one of the biggest or the different things that I kind of would put when I think about the 80s for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling is that we see All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling in their height of success and popularity as a promotion. Women that made it big in the 70s had to forcibly retire right before this decade began or shortly thereafter. This rubbed some of them in the wrong way, and many decided to create alternatives to the monopoly that All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling had. This Generation X population really wanted to see the brightly colored baby faces with their perfectly feathered hair and booming music careers. They loved that blend between pop culture and wrestling coming together. And we even saw that in the States, where we saw WWE become sports entertainment, and they were really blending that MTV pop vibe with the muscles and craziness of wrestling. So I like how we saw that blend or that pattern too in All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling. And on one side, you had a lot of fans, I probably never admitted it when you're in the arena, who liked seeing the underground punk subculture on display with the heels like Atrocious Alliance that would attack fans, reporters, and commentators to show how low they would get to get that win. And to this day, many feats that All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling were able to accomplish still haven't been obtained to this day in the industry. So that really says something and is something to look back at and admire. In the last year of this decade, we see women like Manami Toyota, Akira Hokuto, Bull Nakano, and Aja Kong start to take their place and become some of the best wrestlers in Joshi history in the company. This next decade would be known for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestlers being at the highest level wrestling-wise and deliver insanely entertaining events that are picked apart and studied to this day to the point where it's probably intimidating for a lot of wrestlers that come into the industry now to feel like they can live up to what was done in these decades with All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling and the other promotions that we will definitely bring up in the next episode of the 90s. So if you haven't checked out these amazing things that have happened in All Japan in the 80s, there is so much to view and so much that you can take from this decade that, just like I said at the start of this episode, it is absolutely impossible to cover all of these things in a show, even a show like Deep Dive. But I hope that this show possibly made you feel like you just want to go down the rabbit hole and check out the amazing things that happened with All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling in the 80s. And I thank you so much for watching. And I completely agree with this comment that All Japan in the 80s, what a wonderful time. It definitely was. You really can't put it into words, but there was something so magical about that time in women's pro wrestling, and certainly something that I don't think anyone should try to replicate, but at least try to absorb that feeling that you've had a company really sit down and think about how they can really construct an amazing roster. And despite the fact that obviously it's sad that they had the rule about retiring when you're 26, I do think that the competitive nature that it did generate, with a lot of wrestlers probably feeling that there was so much that they wanted to accomplish at that time, that type of competition and the amazing feuds that transpired because of that is something that is unmatched. And as we're in this glorious era for women's wrestling, currently, I think that you can, of course, see the inspiration with a lot of wrestlers that definitely looked at, specifically a lot of female wrestlers that looked at what All Japan Women's Wrestling did. And you can see that that homage and a lot of respect that's put on certain things that are certainly taken from that time. So that's definitely a lasting impression that this company has left. And I really hope that that's touched upon when Nakano is inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. The best wrestling I've ever seen was the early 90s All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling period. Perfect combination of star power, hot crowds, and great wrestling. I streamed a lot of All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling and refined casual 5-star matches. I definitely agree, and that's why I wanted to make sure that I put into category why the 80s was a peak for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling, and then also why the 90s period of All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling is regarded as being the best time for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling, with the type of wrestling, the thought to the characters, certainly the entrances, the big events that they had, the crossover between a lot of different promotions at the time, which I definitely would be getting into. So it's very hard, which is a good thing, to really like lay down a certain decade between the 80s and 90s for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling, because I think that there's different reasons why either the 80s or the 90s is said to be the best decade, depending on who you're talking to, and also depending on which way that they mean that it was the best decade. So I love hearing this feedback and this love for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling that this episode is bringing, because it is certainly one of my favorite promotions. And just as I was naming off a lot of legends, there's so much that came from that. And as we will see when we dive into the 90s, there were a lot of women that came from All Japan in the 70s and 80s that also gave to wrestling by creating other promotions that pulled off some great feuds and brought some more wrestlers into those decades, like the 90s and 2000s, that we actually love and still hold up dear to this day. So I hope that with this episode, it will continue to allow you to, once again, go and research and look up or even relive a lot of moments that you actually love from All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling. And just like I said, as we definitely get more into the 90s and 2000s, this March series is fully, or I will attempt to cover as much as I can with the history of Joshi wrestling. So I really hope that you enjoyed this episode. If you haven't checked out the 70s decade of All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling from Deep Dive, I really implore you to, and I look forward to the next installment of this Joshi wrestling history series. Once again, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you soon.
Women's Wrestling Talk, the #1 women's wrestling show on the planet.